Good afternoon and welcome to the 125th of the COVID Calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, on September 11, I talk with fire science professor and disaster investigation expert Glenn Corbett. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, September 11, 2020, there are 28,273,312 confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 27,976,756 reported yesterday. 6,430,860 of those cases are in the United States. That's up from 6,387,236 yesterday. There are now a total of 192,616 deaths reported in the United States from COVID-19. That's up from 191,536 reported yesterday, another day with more than 1,000 deaths day to day. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline: Albert Petrocelli, fire chief who lost a son on 9/11, dies at 73. This appeared in the New York Times April 7th by Dan Barry. In recent years, Albert Petrocelli was known in Staten Island's Huguenot section as that nice man with the rosary beads and the bountiful garden. He walked the local streets, rosary in hand, offering to say prayers for those who could use them, a neighbor, a crossing guard, anyone. But Mr. Petrocelli, who died at 73 of the novel coronavirus on April 1st, was more than a retiree with beads and time on his hands. He served in Vietnam. He served as a New York Fire Department battalion chief. He lost a son in the World Trade Center attacks. Most of all, his wife, Ginger Petrocelli, said he was a good guy. Mr. Petrocelli was born on February 21st, 1947, to Peter Petrocelli, a postal worker, and Mary Capace Petrocelli, who ran the household. The family lived first on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and then in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, where he attended William E. Grady High School and planned on becoming an electrician. When he was still in high school, Albert met an Irish-American girl, Ginger Walsh, at a sweet shop in Bay Ridge, and they began to date. After high school, and with the Army about to send him overseas, they married in a hurry on March 18, 1967, the day between the Irish-centric St. Patrick's Day and the Italian-centric St. Joseph's Day. Mr. Petrocelli came home from the war a year later, and before long, the couple had 2 boys. He enjoyed a long career with the fire department, retiring as a battalion chief in Brooklyn. The sons, Albert Jr., a firefighter, and Mark, a commodities broker, both married and settled in Staten Island. Everything was like Mr. Petrocelli once said, and Mrs. Petrocelli finished the thought, the way it should be. On September 11, 2001, Mark was on the 92nd floor of the North Tower when the first plane hit. His father and older brother rushed to Lower Manhattan, determined to find him, but his father's can-do attitude, forged by war and fire, could not overcome what they found and could not find. Mr. Petrocelli was 28. Things were not as they should have been, but the Petrocellis endured. They set up a memorial in their yard. They doted on their 2 granddaughters, Emily and Lily. They celebrated their 50th anniversary in style. They also managed to have a brief moment with Pope Francis during the Pontiff's New York visit in 2015. While attending a ceremony at the National September 11 Memorial and Museum, Mr. Petrocelli held out his firefighter's hat, which contained some rosaries and prayer cards, and asked the Pope to bless them in Mark's memory. The Pope smiled and blessed everything he had, Mrs. Petrocelli recalled. Mr. Petrocelli walked nearly every morning to 7:30 Mass at St. Joseph by the Sea High School. He walked everywhere, in fact, holding his rosary beads of green Connemara marble, that is, when he wasn't nurturing his garden's fruits and vegetables, which he would often give away. Sometimes he gave away the entire plant. He began to feel uncharacteristically fatigued in mid March, declined over the next 2 weeks, and died at Staten Island Hospital's South Campus. In addition to his wife and son, Mr. Petrocelli is survived by two granddaughters. When Mark was killed, I was devastated, Mrs. Petrocelli said, voice breaking, but I had Albie. We did it together. A week after his death, his wife was continuing to receive messages from the many people her husband had touched. I have his strawberry plants, they say. I have his fig trees. All right, I'm going to introduce my guest now. Really thrilled to introduce him. He's a real expert and also a friend. Glenn Corbett is Associate Professor of Fire Science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where he was the former chair of the Department of Protection Management. He's a technical editor of Fire Engineering Magazine and is a former assistant chief of the Waldwick, New Jersey Fire Department. And he's also the former president of the New Jersey Society of Fire Service Instructors. Corbett testified before the 9/11 Commission and the U.S. House of Representatives Science Committee regarding the emergency response and building safety issues of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. He served on the Federal Advisory Committee of the National Construction Safety Team, which investigated the World Trade Center disaster, as well as the Station nightclub fire in West Warwick, Rhode Island. In addition, he continues to serve as the chief technical advisor to the Skyscraper Safety Campaign, a building safety advocacy group created by 9/11 family members. Corbett is a co-author of Brannigan's Building Construction for the Fire Service, 6th edition. In addition, he is the editor of Fire Engineering's Handbook for Firefighters 1 and 2. He also has an avid interest in firefighting and history, authoring The Great Patterson Fire of 1902 and co-authoring Historic Fires of New York City. Glenn Corbett, thank you for making time to come on COVID Calls today.
Well, thank you, Scott. You've been a good long-time friend, so thank you for having me on tonight.
I want to remind everybody you can get your questions in. Just put them into YouTube Live in the chat. You can also put them up on Twitter. Just be sure to tag me at US of Disaster, or just put them directly into an email. Some people like to do that, and I appreciate that, and I'll check email during the broadcast. I'm at sgk23@drexel.edu. So Glenn, let's start the way I usually do, which is just to find out where you're calling in from and how's the pandemic there today.
Well, I'm calling actually from my home in Waldwick, New Jersey. That's northwest Bergen County. We're just below Suffern, New York, sort of where the New York State Thruway sort of goes straight up into the rest of New York. We're just below that area. So as far as the coronavirus, being in New Jersey, of course, just last week, we ended up now allowing some indoor dining. It's been a very slow process, as you can imagine. There's been a lot of concern and, of course, some dissension amongst various, particularly business groups and things over a variety of things, and restaurants being one of the bigger ones. I have to say that overall, I think New Jersey, per capita, we were probably hit the worst in the entire United States because we're right next to New York City. And we had all the same effects that New York had in a much smaller state, basically. So I think, we've certainly flattened the curve here. I think overall we've done a good job within the state of doing the right things. I mean, there's, again, social distancing and the masks. I was just at a luncheon today for someone who's retiring, and we all wear masks during lunch, basically, as much as we could. So I think, like I said, I think we're doing well. Of course, we're all worried about, the upcoming winter season when perhaps this is going to come back again. So I think we have the pieces in place to deal with what we have to. We've identified a lot of potholes along the way. But I think that's where we are right now.
So you are a longtime professor and former department head at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I spent one of my favorite years as a teacher at at John Jay College. It's a remarkable institution. It's a public-oriented, public service-oriented institution. And I'm wondering right now how John Jay, as part of the city university system, how they've coped with COVID-19. Are they trying to reopen?
Well, CUNY made a decision to basically go virtual for the fall semester. CUNY is one of the largest, it's certainly the largest urban university in the country system. It's over 12, well, it's actually 12 senior colleges and several junior colleges. Well over 200,000 students throughout the system. So it's a pretty big organization. And there were again bumps in the road. Our union was very concerned, of course, about bringing people back into the school, because where I am physically located in New York at John Jay, we're at 59th Street and 10th Avenue. We have one square block, basically 58th, 59th, 10th, and 11th. So that's right across from Roosevelt Hospital. And we have over 16,000 students in our college, and trying to get them all in under normal circumstances is an issue. We've had to flatten our schedule because we don't have enough classroom space. Even though we're in a almost brand new building, we're way under capacity in terms of our ability to run more sections of class we would like to. So when this, of course, happened, we ended up, having to think about if we did go brick and mortar, what would we have to do? And of course, we don't have enough space to even probably less than half the number of students we would be able to handle. So that, combined with the financial pressures of the city, we ended up cutting a lot of sections out this semester. So what the net result was, we still had pretty much the same population coming to school. It's just they had fewer sections to choose from. So that meant, of course, that every one of our classes now is pretty full or over full, basically, right now. So I have to say, John Jay itself did, I think, a wonderful job. We're fortunate that we've got some really good people, and particularly even our faculty, who responded very quickly. We were on Zoom within 3 days. We already have Blackboard, for the folks who in the university world, Blackboard we've had for since the 90s, which is great for all the paperwork side of things. But this kind of interaction stuff, it wasn't really well suited for that. So we got onto Zoom within 2 or 3 days. We have a very top-notch faculty who were well versed in that. One particular professor actually made the case to the administration, we need to get on Zoom. I had never even heard of Zoom before. A lot of people had heard of Zoom before this all started.
Right.
So he knew all about it. He's a very tech-oriented kind of guy. He's actually got a SAG card too, Scott. And his most famous role was he was the young kid in Goodfellas in that movie, walking up to that pink Cadillac and looking inside. That was when he was a kid. Now he's a professor at John Jay. So
there you go.
So anyway, he did all that. And so we literally were able to go really almost continue keeping our classes going, with that. So we did pretty well, I think.
Yeah, that's good. And you're teaching online then?
Yes. Yeah, we're, I suspect we're going to be online in the spring as well, because as we know, great, we'll have a vaccine. Let's say we even had the vaccine by the end of the year. We're talking 350 million people. And today they were saying it's probably going to be a double dose. So, that's 700 million doses we're going to have to come up with pretty quickly. And everybody's going to be wanting them. So I cannot see us going back. But again, it's really not my choice. I would personally, I would rather, do this. Listen, I think we all can agree that this is a wonderful technology we have now to do this. Can you imagine if this happened 20 years ago, where we would be? We'd have to shut this college down. There's no way that this would have worked. So thank God for this technology. On the other hand, it is what it is. And people, sometimes I got students who really can't stand it, but it's the only way we can deal with this right now. So, we made it work, basically.
Right. And I think, to what you were saying earlier about the experience that New Jersey and New York have had, is as bad of an April as can be imagined. Leaders are going to be risk averse to bringing people back into situations, maybe less so than in other states where the curve either never came or is only now coming. Glenn, you know more than anybody I'm aware of about how disaster investigations work and how governments function in disaster. And so I want to sort of give you kind of a broad question here about this pandemic. Um, what what has gone wrong? I mean, let me just ask it that way, because I'm always, you see nuances that other people don't always see in the way that agencies interact or don't interact well. I'm curious what I know what has made the headlines, and it's the executive, the president, and his failures, which we've learned even more about this week. But there's a lot more to this disaster than that. And so I'm curious, sort of your take, also realizing are we even halfway through this? I don't know. We're in the middle of something here, but what is your mind on the failures as of now?
Well, actually, I did an op-ed a couple months ago for the North Jersey paper, the Bergen Record, and what I called for in this article was a COVID commission to look at the issues, because in my mind, I mean, we all understand what is, the problems of the actual disease itself, the infection rates, and the proper, PPE that we need, and all those kind of things. But in my mind, there's so many other issues that came to the forefront in the last 6 months that are, in my mind, just as critical. Can you imagine, for example, if our food chain shut down in the middle of all this? Okay, can you imagine if we didn't have, for example, the resources, particularly in, we know, listen, the medical system was strained dramatically, but again, you think about the resources, just the normal day-to-day kind of stuff that we need to function, right? So there's so many government and particularly non-government private sector impacts that we really need to look at, because again, all of us know what happened in the supermarkets. The toilet paper disappeared, the paper towels disappeared, and all those sort of, in the first few weeks, it took months to get that back. Now, what do we learn, for example? Just let's take toilet paper, for example, a crazy example like that. People, of course, bought more perhaps than they needed because they didn't know if they'd ever get it again, basically. So they bought a lot, and we were short for months with that. Well, we've done some initial research, and we find out, for example, that this is not a situation where we can tell the toilet paper manufacturers to turn the switch up and make more. There's a physical limitation on what they can do. And here's an odd one. When we talk about toilet paper, there's really two different industries. There is the stuff that you and I buy in the supermarket, the small rolls. Then there's a whole nother toilet paper industry that supplies all the industrial, commercial kind of business. The toilet papers for the airports and the bigger buildings and stuff, those rolls are gigantic. Those two things do not mix. They cannot switch from one to the other. Mm-hmm. So we learned that, of course. And of course, the big one a lot of us know is the PPE issue. We've outsourced so much of this now that it turns out, in my specific case, one of the roles that I have here locally is, again, being involved with the fire service. I'm president of our local mutual aid association. So it's basically 15 towns in Northwest Bergen County, Mahwah down to Fairlawn. All the fire departments and rescue companies are in there. Our association has been around for 60 years, and we work together to try to improve responses, training. I mean, we do all those kind of things. Well, it turns out that at the end of the day, here in Bergen County, that there were, of course, shortages of PPE. And it was one of these deals, was a friend to a friend. We ended up, actually, our nonprofit association ended up contracting with a local phlebotomy company in Ramsey to actually access PPE because they had a factory in China. Okay. So we were able to access it for our fire departments. We weren't getting it from state. We weren't getting it from the county. We got it ourselves, basically. Mm-hmm. And I think at the end of the day, we spent, each town basically paid us back, but we ended up spending about $60,000 in KN95 masks. Wow. Yeah. That shouldn't happen. I mean, that's the point, is that the PPE, everybody talks about PPE, and that's certainly one of the biggest issues we've had. But I guess what I was saying earlier is that every other thing that we think about, what we do, we've really got to look at that. We need a much broader sort of approach, just beyond the disease itself, but to look at all the tentacles that are tied to that issue. Because again, as I said before, if it was food or our water supply or whatever else, if anything else shut down in the midst of this, we'd really be up the creek. It's bad enough as it was, but it could have been a lot worse. I mean, we can't let our guard down on a lot of these things because again, we're so used to a normal process. So we go to the store, or we pay our bill for this utility, or we do this or that. We don't think about what would happen if that thing was just stopped. I tell my students that. I said, we know how much water, for example, water supply is important for firefighting, right? But I tell you right now, if we shut this New York City's water supply off, the city would literally dry on the vine. Basically, the city would empty out very quickly because water is so essential to a lot of things we do. I said, the one that people forget about is the sewage systems. If we don't have a sewage system in a major city, we got a big problem. So there were impacts in so many areas that I think we got to pay a lot of attention to. We certainly want to pay attention to the disease. How did it spread? What were the missed points along the way? We certainly have to do that, but we can't forget about all the other things that are tied to it that we really should be studying. So, it's important. It's important.
Right. This ties into the discussion I had yesterday with Andy Horowitz and Jacob Remus, and it's not to downplay the important, the core of it, the virus and the transmission of the virus and what happens in hospitals. But what you're really talking about, this disaster, we're talking about society. We're talking about who's vulnerable in society, who has access to resources and who doesn't. And then we're talking about systems. And we're talking about systems which are operating under stress. And so with that in mind, I mean, if your governor, or let's say the governor of Texas or Florida, somewhere called you up tomorrow and said, Glenn, I heard you on COVID calls and need to know, what can we do now? I mean, what kind of advice would you give in the midst of this pandemic for elected officials, policymakers? I mean, we hear a lot about the need for universal testing. Of course, the PPE need is still there. What else is on your mind? Because we're going to be going into the fall. It's going to be a while before there's a vaccine.
Right. So in my mind, I would be, calling up the leaders or associations for all these related issues. Again, like I said, food before. And it's not even just the food stores, but the food purveyors, the food processors. I would be calling up all these groups to say, how are we prepared for the winter here? Are you guys in a sense in a good place in terms of being able to continue to operate? Meaning, remember, we all heard about the pork plants that shut down because so many workers were sick. I mean, are they now in a much better position? How about the refineries? We rely on, we want to be green, but we still rely on oil. And I imagine most people know that we have the bare number of refineries in this country. We're not building any new refineries anymore. Okay. The existing ones are out there. And so we know, even like in California, when one of those goes down for whatever reason, an explosion, a fire, or just normal maintenance, prices start to go up. So we're still reliant on fossil fuels. How are we with that? So I guess, to me, if I was the governor of Texas, I used to live there for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And they said, hey, Glenn, what do you think we should do? I would contact all the particularly vulnerable and essential businesses in the state and find out where they are. And do we got to sort of supplement or do something to support them, right? Which might mean changes. It could even mean changes in regulation. It could be money. It could be other things. But that's what I would do. I mean, because again, we have to know where we are with this. Do the lights go out because my power generating plant has no employees in it anymore that can run the plant? I mean, we have regulations in place, of course, for utilities that, and particularly in the federal level, utilities that, maybe they can't meet those standards, basically. So it's really, as guys, you point out, it's really complicated, but it's not complicated when you're at home and you can't get meat or you can't get milk or something like that. I mean, that's really the thing. And so we got to figure that out. And that's why I'm saying, I think going forward, once the dust settles, the most important thing, Scott, is you know this, there is an issue of timing and the issue of people's attention. We know that once a disaster passes, every day we go past that disaster ending, the interest level, the attention level all goes down, 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 down.
Yeah.
So we got to make sure that we don't lose the enthusiasm, because it can happen again and we're not prepared for it because we didn't study it. That's the thing. And so for your listeners, Scott is one of the leading advocates in the country for studying these kind of things to the depth that we learn what happened, so we can, of course, apply those lessons for the future. So thank you, Scott, for doing that. Because like I said, Scott's dedicated his career to the whole field of disaster investigations. And we need those things because those tell us what happened. And unfortunately, sometimes they take time. They're unpleasant. They're not easiest things to do, but they're critically important.
But we do need those investigations. And as you pointed out, as you talked about your op-ed, and I'll be sure to put that up on Twitter after our conversation, in terms of time, this disaster is it's not a slow disaster like climate change, and it's not an immediate sort of event. It's a meta. It's got a sort of a meta or meso level. It's a time frame we're not used to dealing with. It's stretching emergency management departments. It's stretching first responders who are not used to 50 state EOC activations that last this long. And I think that's so your point about needing to really be attentive to it. I mean, to the way you're talking about, I think a lot of people probably have forgotten, even just listening to you talk, the terror that people felt in March, not just that they might get sick, but going to a grocery store and seeing empty shelves, or everyone's relying on their computers at home to work, to have school, and then someone says, hey, what would happen right now if the power went out? What would happen if everybody working for the power company got sick all of a sudden? These kinds of broader sort of system level, technological system level, logistics level things are not over, as you point out. And, the fall and into the winter and winter storms, they're going to really stress these systems. They do every year. They stress these systems.
Right. We don't have a lot of redundancy in a lot of things in life. There's not a lot of backup. There's not
absolutely
a line of people ready to take over for something. I mean, even here in New Jersey, we had some ambulance corps, which we rely very heavily on volunteer ambulance corps. A couple of them completely shut down. They just stopped responding because they had no ability to do it. And of course, in my world, a little bit older, and a lot of these volunteers are older. They're worried about themselves getting sick, right? Because in those early days, it was really bad. I mean, the hospitals were teeming with people, and the ambulance corps are like, hey, I'm a volunteer. Do I want to volunteer to take some really sick person in my ambulance and try to help them? Yeah, you want to do that, but some of them felt that it was just too much of a risk. Yeah. So, there's certain things, and again, as they say, you can depend on death and taxes. That's about it. But anything else is really subject to failure. And so we got to understand that. So what happens, like you just said, Scott, what happens when the power goes out, when 90% of the people that are working now are working from home on computers like this? What do you do with something like that? So right. It's something that we need to understand where those critical, really critical elements are, that we don't lose, that one more failure, one more domino sort of takes everything out with it. I mean, we can't, this could have happened. And I don't want to really be, the purveyor of death and doom, but we are still, don't forget, we're still vulnerable to terrorism attacks. Okay. And if a terrorist is thinking about things, when's the best time to do an attack? It's during when you're most vulnerable, basically. So we still have to be vigilant about that stuff too. I mean, so we're very focused on, of course, with COVID and our lives that have been changed with that, but we can't forget all those, we'll call them, I don't say even normal, it's not normal, but regular kind of things we worry about in life before COVID, those are still there, and how well are we protected? Or we have enough resources to deal with them. So anyway.
Just want to remind people you're listening to COVID Calls and talking to Glenn Corbett today, a special September 11 discussion. So Glenn, let's go back a little bit. Let's talk about September 11 and one of the interesting things I've noticed in the midst of this pandemic is people, and I think this is appropriate, but people are very careful, um, usually, to honor the fear, concern, and the deaths that are happening right now because of this event. But, when we think about COVID, we have to also think about previous disasters in American history and sufferers and victims. I think in part because those sufferers and victims do form a population of sympathy and support for each other. We have those things to rely on. And so, it seems like September 11 there's been less discussion about it this year than ordinarily. And it's the 19th anniversary and not the 20th. Maybe there's various things about that. But I know to someone like yourself who has been involved in that event in one way or another every day since then, this is an important day. And I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit about your experience on September 11, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of your engagement with understanding what happened on that day.
Sure. So, I at the time in 2001, I was working at John Jay. I was teaching, of course, fire science, and I taught a Tuesday-Thursday schedule. So September 11th, 2001 was on a Tuesday morning. And I tell you, like everybody said, I got in my car that morning and it was like, wow, that's a really nice blue sky. I mean, it was everybody saw the same thing that I saw. And that's why it keeps getting mentioned at times. It was just that kind of morning. It was relatively warm out. It was a beautiful, absolutely beautiful day. And so I had a 9:20 class at John Jay. So my normal route would take me from Northwest Bergen to a park and ride in North Bergen, which is actually not in Bergen County, but it's in Hudson County, right near the Lincoln Tunnel. So I was headed down there to park my car, get in the bus, and then head into the city and go to class. So so as I was traveling down, again, it's one of those things in life you'll never forget it. But there's an area called there's a rest area called the Vince Lombardi Service Area, just sort of south of the beginning or the northernmost end of the turnpike, and the sort of the two spurs sort of cross at that point. Well, I went through that area under a bridge, and I came out the other side, and I looked up. And I could see the North Tower. It was a lot of smoke coming out of the North Tower. And even at a distance, and of course, being a fire person for a fairly long time, I could see that this was an incredible incident going on. I mean, I had no idea it was a plane at that particular moment. I even put the AM radio on. This is before Sirius. Put the AM radio on, and the two New York 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news stations, neither one of them was saying anything about it. Until at one point, like a minute later, as I'm traveling down the turnpike, looking at this, the one reporter said, "Hey, we're sending a helicopter down to the World Trade Center. Something is going on there." So it must have been within probably 3 or 4 minutes of the attack. And so anyway, I continued down the highway, watching this as I get off, went into the park and ride, got on the bus, and seeing what happened in those days. I had my little portable scanner with me so I could listen to what was going on. I had the New York City Fire Department on that radio. So I brought it with me on the bus, and we rode in, and we got probably about 400 feet short of Lincoln Tunnel entrance, and this helix is a curve that goes in on the New Jersey side, and everything stopped. And it stopped in a place that all of us on the bus are looking straight down the Hudson River and watching everything that's going on. I mean, it was incredible. And as we were traveling there, I was thinking, I said, look, this is a major incident. So I did actually make a quick call to my wife because she was working for IBM at the time. And of course, a lot of people weren't at work yet because it was roughly 8:45. So she wasn't there yet. And I left a message at Fire Engineering Magazine, where I'm the technical editor, for the editor who's coming in. I said, look, you probably got to come over here because this is an incredible incident. So anyway, the bus again stops. And we're just watching this, and I'm listening on the radio, and it's unbelievable what we're seeing here. Just by free coincidence, while we're waiting here, they were still letting buses out of the city, and the same bus number, New Jersey Transit number, happened to come right past us, and he stopped. And he opened up his door, and we got off of our bus because we weren't going into the city at this point. We got on the other bus. But as we were waiting there right before this happened, I was thinking, I was actually going to I was teaching a building construction class, and I was going to take my students on this because I knew exactly how to get there, get on the subway. And we we're going to head down there to see this once in a lifetime kind of fire. And of course, that never happened. Thank God. Of course, the end result was what it was. But anyway, I ended up getting back in my car again, and I can't tell you how many cars in the Jersey Turnpike were stopped in the shoulder watching. But I headed home because I didn't know what we were going to be doing in terms of my fire department. And we're at the complete opposite end from the GW Bridge. So we're like the furthest kind of point away, but I didn't know what we were going to do. So I was a line officer as a captain at the time. So we all were, and when I got home, of course, all the guys were at the firehouse, and we were trying to figure out what we were going to do in terms of response, because we knew that New York City was going to have a lot of equipment down there, and we didn't know if we would have to play a role in, doing that. As it turned out, we didn't. Some of us ended up staging that giant stadium, which they didn't eventually need us. But some of the East Bergen towns like Fort Lee and Leonia, some of them went into Upper Manhattan because the firehouses were empty. And on the other end of the city, down the southern end, I know that Monmouth County, for example, sent a bunch of equipment that was there for a week or two. So it was just because we realized that maybe we were going to play a role here. We didn't self-deploy. We followed the rules, because that's a problem in emergency management, is people just showing up. That was an issue in 9/11. The fire department, I had one of my students actually was a logistics chief there. He told me, like the following year, what had happened from his perspective, the logistics chief. He said the best thing for him they ever did down there was get that fence up around the entire site. National Guard came in and set it up because they had no control over people coming in there, and it could have been anybody. And the issue was they were really worried about somebody getting killed in the recovery effort. Now, of course, that happened in a different way. They were concerned initially that they were going to fall in a hole, or a piece of steel would fall on them or whatever. But so that was kind of what happened. Now, the following days, I went down to the site. Some of us from my department went down to the site. In the following week, because school was closed, of course, there was a point at which FEMA perhaps was going to use our college building as a housing site, because it was right along the West Side Highway, and we had multiple showers, of course, for our athletics department, and we had a lot of things they needed. They never ended up using us. But another thing my colleague and I did, Professor Jennings and I, was we did help one of our other students who was the deputy OEM director for the city. And I to this day, I don't know how he did it, but he ended up creating a whole new Office of Emergency Management facility on the pier up in Upper Manhattan near the college, actually. He set it whole thing up in about 2 days. I could not believe it. This is because some of you might remember that on 9/11, the building 7 also was affected and collapsed. That was where the city's OEM office. It was a crazy place for it to be. It should never have been there in the first place. But when the building collapsed, their entire emergency management physicality went with it. And so this fellow set up a whole new center. So that was what happened in the first week or two. We tried to play a role of whatever we could do to help and stuff. So that's kind of what we did.
John Jay, of course, being a college that's educated a lot of firefighters and police, Port Authority police, first responders. You had a lot of students die that day, right?
Yeah, actually, John Jay has the most alum and then current students, and one faculty member who was a friend of mine who I brought on to teach hydraulics. He was killed that day, Andy Fredericks. So John Jay has the unfortunate distinction of having the most people killed in 9/11. We actually just had our service yesterday. It had to be virtual, of course. We have a nice memorial in the middle of the college between our old high school repurposed building and our brand new building. We have a memorial hall there. So we have a service every year. And like I said, had a big impact on us. I mean, just, because we all knew people. I mean, everybody anybody involved with police or fire knew lots of people that were killed that day. So we tried to memorialize the best way we could.
Yeah.
And
well, thanks for going back and reliving that, your experience of that day. I really appreciate that. And I know that you mentioned Charles Jennings, colleague there at John Jay, started asking some questions immediately. You were already certainly aware of the fire vulnerabilities of those towers. That was no secret in the fire department and people who knew about building codes in New York City. But I'm wondering, in that fall, as the fall went on, as I understand it, you were asking. It's very hard. It's hard for people to remember, and they need to know that to ask questions about what happened that day that veered away from the narrative of terrorism. To ask those questions were not always very well received. Even just to get access to the site, to find out what had happened in the buildings, who had evacuated, who hadn't. Those were, I know this sound, I tell students this and they look at me like I'm crazy. I said, those were controversial questions to ask at that time. It's hard to ask those questions, but you and Charles were asking those questions in the fall of 2001. What were you trying to understand?
Well, you're absolutely right, because in most disasters, this is just the nature of the animal, that the time to get information is fairly early on. It's not years later. And so it just through happenstance, we had a relationship, as we do today, with the media in New York, because they reach out to us because they really don't have any other place to go. I mean, they call the fire department or they can call the fire union, but we're the only sort of, let's say, I don't want to say objective because that's not the right word, but the only independent group out there that can sort of talk to some of the technical issues. So it turns out that Joe Calderone, basically from the New York Daily News, gave us a call and to Charles and I, and said, the basic question from him was, how is high-rise firefighting going to change going into the future? And basically we said, we don't know, because we don't know what happened. I mean, this is still within a month of 9/11. We didn't even know how many people have been killed at that point. So that's what we asked that question, and it was printed in the Daily News. And within a couple of days, Charles and I both got phone calls from a woman by the name of Sally Regenhard. Now, Sally is to this day, is an advocate from that day on for building safety. She created a group called the Skyscraper Safety Campaign. But her initial call to us was basically, I want to know the same thing, because my son was killed down there. Sally's son was a probationary firefighter who was killed probably near the South Tower in the Marriott Hotel. And like 40% of the other victims in 9/11, his remains were never recovered. And so she wanted to know what happened to her son. Her son was a recon Marine sergeant, an artist. I mean, he's all these different kinds of things in a young man, that he had a full, of course, just like everyone did, a full life ahead of him. But he was so diverse in terms of his interest and his abilities. He was a mountain climber. I mean, this list goes on and on. But Sally wanted to know what happened, and so did we. So what became really important was the fact that we had the technical knowledge, but she had something we didn't have, and that was moral authority, basically. So we started meeting with her. We discussed what the issues were. What happened on 9/11 in terms of the buildings. A lot of those were issues well before 9/11. 9/11 was a lightning rod for a lot of different specific problems that we felt in our codes and our responses and things like that. So what ended up happening was she created Skyscraper Safety, the campaign. We were her technical advisors. She ended up with a press conference in December of 2001 in front of City Hall. It was an incredibly nasty, rainy day. And but the end result was that there was growing interest in what happened there. And by December, so as I told you before, or you pointed out, I don't know if I mentioned that, there is an element of Monday morning quarterbacking here, okay? Because you walk a very fine line by asking for an inquiry where you just had 3,000 people killed, 343 firefighters and one fire patrolman killed that day. So when you start asking questions like that, some people take umbrage, legitimately. They're concerned that you're trying to move away from the terrorism issue over to something that they did. And of course, that's not the case. We wanted to know why they died, and what role did the variety of issues around the Trade Center itself play. What were the roles of the buildings, basically, in their deaths? So Skyscraper Safety had that press conference. Fortunately, we were heard by an upstate New York congressman by the name of Sherwood Boehlert from Utica, New York. He happened to be the head of the House Science Committee. They called us and said, we think there's something here. We'd like an inquiry as well, because at that point, the inquiry consisted of FEMA doing an inquiry with a contract with the American Society of Civil Engineers. The problem that we were arguing wasn't that the people involved were, not well qualified. They were very well qualified people, but they didn't have several things. They didn't have money. Everything costs something. They didn't have authority, meaning that they couldn't secure evidence. They couldn't get access to the site where they perhaps wanted to go. And they also had no time. These were volunteers. They weren't even being paid to do this. So it's a really long story that, involves, a variety of people. But at the end of the day, it was Sally's moral authority that opened the doors for people like me, Charles, to actually push for this inquiry. And we actually did get that. So the end result was we were successful in getting a new law passed called the National Construction Safety Team Act. It's, to this day, it's still remarkable, okay, that the hearings were in March and May, and the bill was actually introduced on the floor in July. That bill on the floor in the House in July was signed by the president in October of 2002. I mean, it's just, nobody believes that it went that quick.
Yeah.
But the reason it is because it was so logical. We didn't have a building investigative authority that had resources to do what was needed. But I can tell you along the way, Sally did, and her co-chair, Monica Gabriel, did a wonderful job, because along the way, this bill ended up going to the Senate, of course, once the House was done with it. And it turned out that Congress was in New York in 2002, the first anniversary. And lo and behold, who was the chairman of the equivalent Science and Technology Committee of the Senate, but John McCain. So Sally found out that John McCain was on Staten Island for some event. And so both of them drove over there, showed up. I said, Senator McCain, the bill that we're really interested in getting a technical investigation of what happened so we can learn the lessons and apply the recommendations, basically, that bill is in your committee. Do you know that was like a Saturday? By Tuesday, it was voted out of the entire Senate. It got through its committee and out of the Senate. So there's a remarkable set of circumstances that happened to get us to the point where the National Institute of Standards and Technology got $16 million, more than the 9/11 Commission got, by the way, to do the technical inquiry of that day. And what do we get? We got several large reports, but most important to us were what were the tangible recommendations that could be implemented to help the future, basically. Because in my mind, and a lot of people, like-minded people, the best memorial you could ever build to a fallen firefighter in my world is changing things, right? So the future, so you don't have that incident happen again, or the same kind of circumstances. So what do we get? We got much better high rises because of it. Up until 9/11, if Scott Knowles was building a high rise in Philadelphia that was 10 stories high, by definition was a high rise. If he built one that was 200 stories high, it was a high rise. But the requirements were identical for buildings like this. It made no sense. So we got a lot of improvements. We got better firefighter communications in buildings, which now, of course, is a big issue now because of active shooter issues that are going on, because the changes in our building and fire codes, which allow those systems, it also applies to schools and things like that, where radio signal amplification is so important. But we got better, what we call fireproofing insulation for the steel. We got better water supplies for sprinkler systems. And in terms of command and control, there are a lot of good things coming out of that. But let me give you an example where one thing we didn't get. If some of your listeners might remember photographs from that day, in which that you could see firefighters, still pictures of firefighters going up the stairs and people coming down.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the people coming down, they're stationary and they're sideways, leaning up at the wall to let the firefighters go by. We thought it was a no-brainer to get from what the national standard is for high-rise stairs is 44 inches. What that means is 2 times 22. What's the 22? That's the average width of a shoulder of a World War I era person, 22 inches. Okay, that's how far back in time that goes. So 2 22s, 2 people can theoretically go up and down. Nobody's a 22-inch shoulder width anymore, okay? People are bigger.
Right.
And so the 44 has been around for a million years, and we wanted to change. You cannot imagine the pushback we got from all sides, the private sector particularly, but we also got pushback from GSA, the Government Services Administration, the agency that owns federal buildings. They fought us on it too. It's like, all we're asking is go from 44 to 56. They could tell you exactly how much less rentable space they would get for that additional 12 inches. So that's one thing that we sort of got a little bit out of, but it's one that was really never fixed. So, but the bottom line was this: we put in place a structure for future building disasters. And this now is done West Warwick, Rhode Island nightclub fire investigation. They've done Joplin, Missouri for the tornado several years ago. And now I believe they're still working on Hurricane Maria, and some of the issues in Puerto Rico. So it's a good first start to get sort of the technical information out of these disasters that we can actually turn them around and put them into better regulations or better protocols too. I didn't really get into that, but New York City Fire Department will never ever send every fire rescue unit. They have 5 of them in the city. Those are the elite units. They'll never send every one of them to a major incident ever again. They will never put their command post in the building that's involved ever again. There's several things that theoretically won't ever happen again because of these inquiries.
That's, those reforms that you mentioned is also, it's a laundry list of all of the vulnerabilities that the Twin Towers had. And as you said, not every one of them was addressed, but the importance of that study and the way you tell the story there, that without Sally Regenhard's effort and the marshaling of her moral authority as mother whose son had died,
none of this would have happened.
None of it would have happened. We tend to think, well, it's just logical. Won't we want to try to figure out what happened in the disaster? And I just want to underline that for our discussion, because people should not assume that just because we should know what's happening with COVID-19, that we will. I mean, I think that the lesson I draw from what you're talking about is that we have to always be vigilant in these disasters, that the process of investigation is, we might not like this, but it is ultimate. It's a human one, and therefore it's a political one. And political pressure will have to be applied because there are strong interests that would rather just forget and move on for a variety of complicated reasons. And that was certainly true, as you said, with September 11, the towers, from the Port Authority to the GSA and many other entrenched interests who would like to say, well, that was a one-off thing. We can't use that as a basis to plan the future. And as you've just pointed out, well, actually, the lessons learned there not only have affected high rises in the United States, I mean, it's affected high rise construction in other parts of the world as well. Glenn, let me, since we've been talking about Sally and the efforts of skyscraper safety, you were also engaged in discussions about the memorial and continue to be, if I understand, I think you are. It's a difficult topic, but I want to sort of get into it a little bit. What should the memorial have been? What are some of your concerns about the memorial? I'm talking about in New York now, the memorial that we have.
Right. So, again, working with Sally, of course, as the recovery efforts ended 9 months later, there's all the big questions about what are we going to do with Ground Zero at this point. Everyone knew there would be a memorial. The question was what it would look like. There was this series of we call them town hall meetings called Listening to the City, which Sally participated in as a family member. And people were asked questions about what it should look like and what have you. But at the end of the day, the memorial, I think that a lot of people wanted, is not what we ended up with. I mean, and I'll come out and I'll just say it myself. I'm not a family member. I'm not. I mean, I had lots of friends that were killed that day, but I'm not a family member directly. And so a lot, but again, talking to a lot of family members, I think a lot of people assumed that, it would be dedicated to the victims of that day. A museum was really never part of it in the early days. I mean, in terms of detailed discussions. And to make a really long story short, I think even a lot of your listeners might remember there was a section of I think it was the North Tower. There was a section of the exterior wall column set for like 10 stories high, and it was in every photograph you see this piece of it. Everybody, for example, thought they were going to preserve that. Okay, that would be part of some kind of memorial, like a Hiroshima type memorial, where they actually leave the extant building, the pieces of it left behind. That would be part of it. It never ended up, of course, being part of it. What most people thought would be something, certainly wonderful, but nowhere near the amount of money that was eventually spent on. Close to $1 billion was spent on that memorial. I think, in my mind, like I said, talking to a lot of family members, they wanted something that was very respectful, something that was focused on the victims that day, and they didn't get that. So I just wrote in a recent op-ed, because some of your listeners know about the issue with the reading of the names this year and the Tribute Light. I wrote an op-ed for the other group that Sally's involved with. It's a parents and families group for firefighters and World Trade Center victims. Basically, the op-ed said that, we had hoped for something much more respectful for the victims, and we ended up with two of the largest waterfalls, man-made waterfalls ever made, that really abstractly reflect the buildings. They don't reflect people. Even the names, in the earliest of days, the names were never going to be above ground, because a lot of family members fought that tooth and nail to get at least the names put above ground. But today's 9/11 Memorial is very much an urban park. It's not. It's not like, if anyone's been to Oklahoma City, there's only two ways to get into that memorial on either side. This is not that way. It's wide open, and you can expect, when you have a wide open area, what you're going to find inside of it. I mean, it's not, in my mind, it's not a respectful place. There's no reverence there. A lot of people are there taking selfies, and it's really a tourist destination more than anything else. And so we've been really, we started off, ironically, Scott, with Sally and I and some other folks. We started off more about the safety issues, because this is still a terrorist target. That site is still a big terrorist target. And the original design, which had people going below grade for the memorial itself in the waterfalls, there was so many, in our minds, so many vulnerabilities that they did actually change that. But what ended up happening was they ended up merging the memorial and the museum together in 2006 because of the financial. This was out of control financially. They merged the two together to save money. But what they did basically is take two distinct things and weave them together. I am totally opposed, personally, to matching museums and memorials together. They're two separate things. One is an education facility. One, in fact, is a remembrance facility. They're two different things, and they're in conflict, I think, in this situation. Sally's son, in the memorial hall where the photographs are, they're all, I call mechanical, because the photographs are about that big, and they're stacked up to the 12-foot level in his room. His photograph is at the 12-foot level. You can't even see his face up there, okay? If you want to know anything about him, okay, you got to go to a kiosk and start punching information. You don't even, so it's crazy. And yet, the 19 hijackers, they're in the museum too, okay? And their photographs and descriptions are at eye level, okay? Where this doesn't make any sense, at least in my mind, of trying to memorialize somebody by putting the murderers in the same room, basically, or the same area. So I just can't understand it. And of course, the big issue, Scott, that is that for the family members, I mentioned earlier that 40% of victims have never been recovered. Sally's son is one of those victims, and they were totally opposed to putting the remains in the museum. That's where they are. Now, they're not on display, but they're in the basement. They're at the lowest level of the museum behind a blue wall, basically. And if, Scott, for your listeners, if anybody is listening here, unless you're a family member, you got to pay $26 now to go in there to pay your respects, okay? We thought the human remains should have been above ground, something like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, something like that, which would not only be accessible, would probably bring a lot more respect to the above ground memorial as it stands right now. So at the end of the day, I wrote an op-ed a couple weeks ago in the New York Post, basically calling the National Park Service to take over the above ground memorial and to bring the remains up. That's what we're calling for. And we actually have a Congressman Rose now on Staten Island who heard our call for this, and he wrote a letter basically as a congressman to asking to meet with the National Park Service to do exactly that. That's what's required legally for the Park Service to get involved, is they need to have a request from a congressman, and we have that now. So I don't know where this is going to end up, Scott. I know that the Memorial Museum, their total funding is $80 million a year. That's $10 million an acre down there. For comparison purposes, Yosemite is in the $30 million range. That's the size of 3 states, basically, 3 small states. So this is 8 acres, $80 million an acre. Their entire money supply, of course, was primarily through the museum admissions. That stopped in March. So they are so far financially in a bad situation that this is the time that they really need to rethink this whole thing. And perhaps the Park Service will play the primary role here with the memorial, and then their foundation can deal with the museum part of it. But it was something that I personally don't like the design. It was chosen by a group of people, including the designer of the Washington's Vietnam Memorial. And listen, I'm old school. I'm in my 60s now. I'm a traditionalist. I like less abstraction and more significance. Right. Okay, so that's where I am on.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you going into that detail, because once again, there are meaningful lessons to be learned there. If people need to know that there's a lot of political angst that can erupt around memorials, memorial designs, memorial locations. And, as you were describing the problem, particularly, to me, the most acute one, which is still, I've never heard a sufficient answer, is whether or not the museum itself, there, as you describe it, it functions as a de facto cemetery, because you have these unidentified remains within the structure itself. Most people aren't aware of that. And, part of that also reflects the overwhelming challenge that the coroner's office in the city of New York, medical examiner's office, has had ever since then, and the burden, which I imagine this, probably you thought about this as well when we saw that footage of Hart's Island being used in April to bury people because they ran out of places to bury people in New York City. I mean, so once again, we're facing these kind of issues. We're not really set up to deal with the metabolism of death that we saw on September 11 and that we're still seeing. We certainly saw in April and May with COVID. That's
a good point, Scott. That's a good point, because you're right. I mean, when it came to COVID, think of historically, there's a place called North Brothers Island up across from the Bronx in Hell's Gate, right? That was a communicable disease hospital. They built that 100 years ago to deal with situations like this, so they can immediately have a place to send people. We don't have that. I mean, it's remarkable to think that the folks around 100 years ago were smart enough to say, hey, we should have a place that if something like this happens, that we can send people. And of course, the most famous occupant of that location was Typhoid Mary.
Right.
So we don't have that. I mean, it's remarkable that I don't think anybody's even mentioned that now, is that we should be thinking about going forward. We should have places that would be, regional places where we can send people with things like COVID that would be fully staffed and fully equipped to deal with communicable diseases. They would have the ventilators, that have all the stuff they need. But on the other hand, if this happens maybe 50 years from now, we'd use these buildings for some other purpose, for training or something else, but they would be available to us. We ended up overwhelming the hospitals in the New York City area. I mean, there were just patients everywhere. Yeah, so you're right. And we didn't learn. I mean, that was a lesson they knew 100 years ago, and we forgot it, basically.
That's interesting. It's a tie back to discussion I've had recently with Christos Linteris and Graham Moody, who are public health historians, talking about the 19th century knowledge, dealing with pandemics and quarantine facilities, in some cases where people were encouraged to take up residence for a period of time in a quarantine facility, forced in some cases, invited, but also taken care of, because the reality was you couldn't just leave people to die in the street or expect that they would come forward for quarantine if they thought they were going to be badly treated. So many of these lessons from that deeper past, maybe because we don't like to think about these kinds of things, or we think that we're so modern that it'll never happen to us again. I want to, cognizant of time, Glenn, I want to get to another topic if we can, and it's a case where you and I work together, and you were the lead investigator, organizer, and co-chair of an investigative commission which looked at a building collapse in Philadelphia. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so that's, now you go from being an advocate for skyscraper safety to actually being in charge of an investigation. A little uncanny to find yourself on that side of the table, I suppose. Can you say a little bit about what that was like and what the outcome of that investigation was?
Right. Thanks, Scott. So to set the stage, this is an incident which occurred several years ago in Philadelphia on Market Street. Basically, it was a situation where a series of buildings were being demolished to make way, I would assume, for, I think it was, the plan was to have high rises put up. They were old, we call ordinary construction buildings, basically brick with wooden frame type buildings. There was a whole block full of them. And the situation was such that at the very end of the block at 22nd Street, there was a one-story. The other ones were all 3-4 story buildings. There was a one-story building at the end of the block at 22nd Street, which housed a Salvation Army thrift store. And basically what happened was, of course, for those who are familiar with it, was that as the building demolition was proceeding adjacent to this thrift store, the operator of a piece of heavy equipment knocked over a freestanding wall, which effectively fell onto the store and killed several people, including two young women, one of which was the daughter of the city treasurer of the city of Philadelphia. And so what ended up happening, of course, was there was a lot of course, scrutiny of how did this happen and what why did this take place and things like that. But what the most important thing was that that a phone call was made to a guy by the name of Scott Knowles. Okay. And Scott actually received a phone call of the city treasurer, the woman who lost her daughter. And she called up Scott and said, Scott, I see that you write about disasters and disaster investigations. What do you think we should do? So that led to a phone call with the three of us. And the woman's name is Nancy Winkler. The three of us had a phone call. And basically, one of the recommendations to her was that there's more to this than just the collapse. There's a series of things going on in the city that allowed that to happen. We need to know a lot more about specifically the Department of License and Inspections. So she went, because she had the moral authority like Sally did. She had the moral authority as a mother of a woman killed in a collapse, but also the city treasurer. She said to Mayor Nutter, I want a commission, and they did that. And so, for your listeners, Scott and I ended up on the commission. And we had, I think, initially about 20 some people on it. It sort of narrowed down to the end. We were about 16 months out, roughly, when we finished our report. We were down to probably about 8 or 10 at that point. But most importantly about it was this. I think the important things in my mind about the commission were that the city gave us a pretty wide charge, right? That the executive order allowed us to look at things, not just the collapse. That's important, certainly important. But what is going on in that organization that allowed this to happen in the first place? That's a primary question. So they gave us a charge that was a wide net. And I've been involved in commissions and things over the years and stuff. But one important thing I learned was when you put a new commission together, a group like this, you're bringing all sorts of people, some of which know each other, a lot that don't. That if you open it up for like, what are we going to do kind of thing. You know, it takes forever to get a plan of action. So I think the most important thing I ever did there was before we started, before the first meeting happened, I put a specific plan of action in place and on paper. And then the first day we met, I said, here's something I'd like to do. Can we agree on this? And they basically did. So we went soup to nuts. I mean, we looked at the management of the organization. We looked at the other jobs that they have to do in terms of permitting. We got deep into the weeds of the responsibilities of the inspectors and people like that. We looked at their salary levels. We looked at all sorts of things that were in one way or not relevant to the operation of this city agency. And after about 16 months, we got our report put together. I have to say a couple of bumps in the road here. Thank goodness the city did give us an office, and they gave us a staff person to help us, but there really was no clerical help. And thank God we had some folks who were involved. Peter Vira was the executive director. I was the chairman of the commission. He was the executive director. He brought in some other folks to help us, and those law offices helped us with the clerical side. I think that was really important. We had that. So anyway, at the end of the day, we wrote a very lengthy report. Actually, Scott's chapter he wrote the first chapter, sort of set the stage and what this Department of Lights Inspections was all about. How was it created in the 1950s? It was as Scott pointed out, it was a good government initiative to try to avoid things like bribery and all this other kind of stuff involving in building inspection stuff. So they wanted to centralize it all in one place. They could control it. The problem is, by doing that, they made it worse in a different way. It was totally ineffective in a lot of cases. So, the bribery is probably still there, but the effectiveness was really compromised as time went on. So the point was, I think we came up with a really good report. They made a handful of changes. There's a lot of significant ones they haven't made, but Philadelphia, you would think that, for example, in the city of Philadelphia, one of the largest cities in the country, that they would have a structural engineer on their staff. When we were there, they had no structural engineers. They had no electrical engineers in their staff. They third-party inspections. They allowed private practice inspectors for electrical inspection. There's a lot of things there's just so many things that we came across. We did, and one additional point is we spent a lot of time talking with people. We interviewed lots of employees and anyone else who was interested in talking to us. We set up a website, a phone number, a place we could meet them if we needed to. They didn't want to do it where they were working. We tried to make it as easy as possible for anyone who want to get involved, that they could do that. And I think we came up with a really good report. I think, it's something that could be a roadmap, perhaps, to another analysis of another building department somewhere. We looked at all aspects that we could think of that again, at the end result, affected their operational abilities, basically. So that's what happened, and I'm proud of it. I'm sure Scott's proud of it, and it's something that, and of course, we all did a pro bono, by the way, too. There was no money involved with this, although Scott knows I had about $4,500 worth of reimbursable travel expenses in my car from New Jersey, Philadelphia for like 16 months.
It's quite an undertaking.
Anyway, it was an interesting thing, but I think it's a landmark report too, because my world outside the college is a lot of code stuff. That's where I spent 10 years in code enforcement in San Antonio and Austin. And I still involve a lot with the regulatory side of things. And I don't know of anybody who's ever done this kind of study of any building department in America. So, like I said, I think we did a wonderful job, really. If I can pat you and me on the back.
Well, yeah, absolutely. You've earned that for sure. And another thing that strikes me as you tell it, how crucial it was that you came into that investigation. First of all, that the mayor, and yeah, I agree with you. I wish more of the findings and the recommendations had been implemented, but that the mayor was willing to allow experts to run this. And the city council, to its credit, did its own sort of set of hearings, and they had their own process, and there was a criminal process going. There were many different things happening simultaneously, but that the mayor did bring you in And I think, again, it's just a crucial thing to know that this combination of a technical expert, you, with the moral authority of Jay Bryan and Nancy Winkler, who were mourning their daughter, Anne Bryan, that was a powerful combination. And I think, once again, it's relevant to where we find ourselves right now. And we're almost up on time, but I think the good place to close out, maybe in this discussion, people, there's no point in trying to hide the fact that you and I respect each other's work and work together. And we co-authored an opinion piece, which is out in Issues in Science and Technology, in which we lay out what we see as some ideas for how not just a COVID-19 investigation should work, but that the federal government in the United States needs a more robust investigative body, which we call for in that op-ed. And I encourage people to look at it and support it if they feel like they can. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit to you, what are some of the critical things that an investigative board like that should be able to do, Glenn?
Well, one of the larger issues I think here is that I guess the public thinks that there's these investigative authorities to look at a variety of things. I mean, everybody's familiar with the NTSB, but the NTSB is basically looking, of course, their big issue is aircraft accidents. They're in charge of pipelines and some other things as well, and trains actually to a certain extent. But the problem is that a lot of these are siloed in such a way that they're just like a slice of potential issues out there that need to be looked into. And so that's what we've got sort of in the federal government right now. And so if we think about going forward, the government really should have sort of one central place that we can go to that would be in charge of saying, hey, this is an important thing we need to know more about. Let's dig into it and figure out what are the issues here. Are there gaps in what we know and what we understand? Or is it simply people didn't follow normal protocols or rules or whatever? So I think that's to understand that we don't have something like that right now. We don't have a body in the federal government that can pick up on COVID, for example, or pick up on really anything that happens in terms of disasters. You think about that bridge up in Minnesota several years ago across the Mississippi River. The civil engineers studied that thing, but there was really no federal response per se. I mean, in terms of a detailed investigation, to my knowledge. Right. So the thing is that we need to have sort of I don't want to say one-stop shopping, but that kind of thing, in the sense that when something like this happens, oh, gee, Scott, the National Disaster Investigation Board is going to be looking into that. There should be like a normal public response that way, right? That, oh, they've got that, right? They've got that. So that's I think the big issue here is to make sure that we have that capability in the United States, and that over time we can build our ability to sort of collate, to gather data about similar incidents and things like that in one place, because we don't have that right now. If Scott wants to know about an explosion, he might go to the National Fire Incident Reporting System, but all that's going to tell him is the incident itself and how many trucks went there and how many people were there. It's not like a detailed report that he would want to know more about what happened there. So we need that. And I think, this COVID is the best example, because in my mind, if a magic wand were waved and they said, Glenn, you're the chair of the new Disaster Investigation Board, the first thing I would do is figure out, put all the different issues down that I could think of, and try to group them together in distinct areas that we need to do some digging into to find out. Because like I told you, it's great to know that we're able to sort of get a vaccine for COVID. But again, as you pointed out before, if the power went off or our food chain stopped, that is worse than, it could be a lot worse than COVID itself, right? And we need to know how vulnerable we are. We know about PPE. We know that all that went overseas. So we're trying to deal with that, but that's just one slice of all these different things. So I would populate it with people with subject matter expertise. I wouldn't have politicians on there. I'd have people who are historians and engineers and food purveyor experts and
Sure,
transportation
logistic experts,
utility
absolutely.
experts. I mean, there's a laundry list of people that I'd like to
Yeah.
have on this that I'd say, hey, what the heck happened at that pork plant? So I'd have people that have general knowledge about that, and then they could set up their own inquiry into what was going on there so we can learn from it. What happened that we didn't have mechanisms in place to keep that pork plant running? So, you know what I'm saying? We need subject matter expertise more than we need political horsepower, I think, because at the end of the day, it's what the truth that comes out, the facts that come out, the information that comes out, that's most important. That's most important. It's not like, gee, this group didn't do this or that group was bad or whatever. It's what physically happened. What can we do to change it? So that's the way I look at it. And unfortunately, one last point.
Yeah.
I've been doing this a while now. And like I said, I'm also technical editor, one of my 1099s and technical editor of Fire Engineering magazine. We're a 145-year-old journal. It's one of the oldest trade journals in the country. I can tell you that in the last 30 some odd years I've been involved with the magazine, that as time has gone on, it's gotten more and more difficult to get information, in our case about specific fires, because of all of this issue of litigation and shutting down, basically clamming up at the city level to not put a report out. I mean, there's fires, you know how we converse in the fire service about a deadly fire? We do it verbally at conferences because the cities won't let the fire department write even a report about what the heck happened because of all the liability issues and stuff. That's a major issue in the investigation field right now, is that the desire to protect a city or a government against litigation is to clam everybody up and not put anything out. And so that doesn't help anybody. You know, it doesn't help anybody learn what happened. So what we do is we do clandestinely, we talk at conferences, hey, what happened at that particular fire? And we talk to the guys and gals that were there, and they tell us, you know, this is what happened. So it's all done informally, but it shouldn't be that way. It should be something that's readily accessible to the public. Is it bad? Is it bad to look at? Yes, and bad in the sense that it's horrific in some cases. It's you know, very mentally challenging. It's all those kind of things. But at the end of the day, that's what's going to help us going forward. We have to learn these lessons. I teach a class on 25 most significant fires in America. And one of the points I make is that when I go through my fires, I go, this is a lesson we learned 100 years ago, and we repeated the same thing over again. That's what happens when we don't have any kind of clearinghouse, central place to do this kind of stuff. So that's a long answer to a short question. So.
It's an important answer, and I also didn't know you taught a class on the 25 most important fires in American history. Someone asked for that syllabus, and I think many people listening would like to know that. But and just, I mean, this has been a theme of your discussion today, which I really appreciate, which is that just because it seems sensible that we would want to learn from a complicated disaster, cascading disaster, doesn't mean that people of goodwill might still find it very hard to do it. And we also have to take into account that not everybody's of goodwill.
And we got to sort of put the Monday morning quarterbacking issue aside. I could tell you, like I said, working with Sally particularly, I was the person who also, besides being the technical person, I was the person to essentially walk a fine line, right? Of saying, okay, we can ask about this now, but we can't ask it like yesterday, right? Yeah. That we had to watch as things evolved and when we could push certain issues, because some of this stuff, I guarantee you, people were pretty upset with me, and I guess with Sally as well, saying, how dare you question these heroes of that day, okay? And of course, you know, we were very careful about what we did, because Sally, this is virgin territory for her. She had no idea. She never was in the fire service. She had no idea what the landscape was like. So we did this. And it was always in the name of really memorializing the people that were killed that day, to learn from what happened. Because every time somebody would say something like to me, I go, look, I knew Ray Downey, you know, I knew Andy Frericks. I go down the list of people that were particularly close to me, you know, and particularly with my work with fire engineering. And I said, I can guarantee you, both of those two guys, for example, neither one of them would ever said, hey, Glenn, please don't look at what happened their day, ignore what happened and just move on. They would not have done that, because they were in the same boat that I was in before 9/11. They were really into understanding what happened in a professional way. So again, this is something that people, we have to sort of come to grips with that it isn't a pleasant situation a lot of times to ask certain questions. But at the end of the day, if we're gonna move ourselves socially forward to better protecting ourselves against a variety of things, this is all we can do. We have to learn from this stuff, because it's not only a mistake, it's a tragedy to the people that died to just ignore what happened. So,
reminding folks you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And Glenn Corbett, thank you so much for making time on September 11th, this 19th anniversary of that day. And to Sally Regenhard, if you're listening, and to all of the other victim families, we're thinking about you. And thanks especially to Sally, to all she's done in the name of Skyscraper Safety and for victims and sufferers of disaster, and Nancy Winkler and Jay Bryan as well. Glenn, thanks a lot.
Scott, by the way, Scott, I have to thank you, because you are the tip of the sword when it comes to these kind of things, because what your work is really moving us forward here. Okay. And we all appreciate that. So thank you as well. And particularly for this program and stuff, because this is a lot. I'm sure this is a lot of new stuff for a lot of people. They don't know a lot about it, which they normally would. So thank you.
Well, we'll keep talking about it. We need a lot of solidarity and knowledge at this time for sure. Thanks again, Glenn. And we'll talk to you soon. And everybody out there, stay healthy, and we'll see you Monday, 5 o'clock.